The following is made possible by Bernina of America, delivering sewing technology and education to sewers worldwide, and by Vogue and Butterick Patterns, providing fashion and lifestyle leadership for the home sewer into the next century.
Sewing Today. Contemporary designer fashions brought into the home sewing environment with the latest technology. New fabrics, colors, and textures. Elegant apparel that you can create with your own hands. Personal style, custom fit, and affordability. Join former Miss America and home sewer Nancy Fleming, along with designer instructor Kenneth King, as they take you behind the scenes and into today's world of exciting fashion, creative home decorating, and crafts, and a way you can do it yourself through Sewing Today.
Hi, I'm Nancy Fleming. Welcome to the Best of Sewing Today video series. It's always a treat to get behind the scenes with famous designers and learn some of their sewing construction secrets. This video is a compilation of the apparel programs from our public television series Sewing Today. You'll learn tips and techniques associated with some of the best American designers, such as Victor Costa, Bill Blass, or Linda Allard of Ellen Tracy. As a special bonus to you for purchasing this video, we've included extra footage and information not seen on the original Sewing Today programs due to time limitations. This new footage appears when you see this symbol on the screen. So let's begin with our first show highlighting sewing with lace and Victor Costa's insightful tips and techniques for special occasion dressing. Welcome to Sewing Today. Most of us live our lives in casual or contemporary sportswear, but when an occasion arises that calls for a drop-dead gorgeous dress, we think of designer Victor Costa, whom we feature today. We'll meet Mr. Costa in his Dallas showroom and visit his boutique to find out why he loves to work with lace. We'll show you how to fit a flattering bodice on this designer gown, and then expert sewing instructor Kenneth King will take us through the stages of lace construction. We'll give you tips on laying out lace to maximize its effect. Vogue pattern designer Reg Fairchild will show you how to personalize a wedding gown pattern. But first, let's meet Victor Costa. Victor, I know you studied design in Paris and you return every year for the Paris collections. What is it that makes those collections so alluring to so many of us?
Well, it's such an exciting time because the press of the entire world converges on Paris to see the unlimited creativity that all the couturiers can do, because it's a time when they can create without boundaries of price, because some of those dresses go up to $100,000. And I just love to sit there and just soak it all in like a sponge.
Well, you know, don't you think as home sewers, we're able to get closer to the collections because we can make things by hand?
Yes, with the shrinking global economy, it's on the Paris runways today and you see it today. And I know a lot of the home sewers are just like I am. They just love to be excited about new fashions and to see the new touches and the new trims and the new colors.
Well, I'm always excited by what you do with trims. What are some of the couture touches that a home sewer can learn from to create a really extra special occasion dress?
Oh, I love lace, and that's one of the mediums that is easiest for the home sewer once she gets the knack of it. Lace is one of the oldest forms of fabric known to us, and there you can already have a design in place of flowers or vines or geometrics or paisleys, and taking that design that's already there and then actually embellishing it.
Let's look at what you have done with lace and some of these wonderful gowns.
Well, I always think of my aunt who's busy needle pointing, and she really could be embellishing lace for me because it's much the same thing. Here we've taken just a little kind of sheer ribbon and circled the lace and then embellished it with the black ribbon so that you took a very flat medium and you've turned it into a three-dimensional. And another wonderful touch is to take something like black lace and then put color under it. Here I've used red Duchesse satin under it, and that really shows the dimension of the lace.
And of course the sleeves are so dramatic too.
Sure, they're just giant bows that are formed from the lining of the satin, and they kind of tie it all in together.
Now this is a rather simple tailored line, but look what happens with the lace.
Yes, you take a basic cotton little boxy jacket and you get some lace by the yard that is re-embroidered with a cord, and you cut it, and you can actually do your little frog detail, the feeling of the military, but glamorized with the yellow and the black, and then again outlined in the paillettes. So you have two applications there that a home sewer can do. Few people understand that lace really doesn't have a grain or or a bias that it is really meant for ornamentation in most instances.
This lace jacket really is the background for all kinds of other treatments and embellishments.
Absolutely. So often there's a color requirement when someone says, I'm going to be a member of the wedding party and the bride wants me to wear yellow, for instance, and you go out and you try to find yellow lace that matches yellow chiffon. The idea is find the basic canvas that you want of yellow and then match some trims to it. Here, white lace I've taken and the yellow seam binding and done little minuscule roses. The little rosettes are made from little narrow seam binding that's twisted around and kind of scrunched and tacked in place. And then the flowers and leaves are outlined in kind of a chalk sequence so that it just barely catches the light. It is not shiny. And of course it has that wonderful moving skirt that gives motion for those social occasions, whether it be dancing or floating down the aisle. And the trick here is to sew the skirt from a dropped skirt yoke so that the fullness comes just where the jacket ends.
Now we've seen long and we've seen short, both very dramatic. Now we have a combination of long and short.
That's right. Here the column of length is broken with this overskirt of satin. And notice that the lace is just, the scallop lace is floating free, and I've appliqued just the top. It shows you how you can embellish for importance and drama. And of course this one is all lace, but the idea here is the feeling of lingerie worked for late day, so that it's as if the skin is showing through, but it's nude crepe de chine. Just as in the beginning we had red or yellow, here I've used skin tone under the lace and outlined it with velvet ribbon. And these little stripes of velvet really give you a very slim feeling.
Well, these are some of the latest trends in the grand occasion dress, but how about bridal? Do women want to be more traditional, stay the same in bridal wear?
Now, that's the grandest occasion of all, and we can have a combination of all good things. If you come over here, I'll show you. A woman can be anything she wants on her wedding day. I always say, close your eyes and fantasize. You can do a flat front with a full cathedral train. A morning wedding dictates a shorter length. Here, a very special little short white dress. Or color. Color can make wonderful things happen to the complexion and bring a blush. Here, kind of a candlelighty pink with the lace all embellished. Or if you really want to be the blushing bride, you can take white organza, put it over pink, and all the lace that's cut in garlands. If you'll hand me that, I'll show you. Here's a 36-inch lace that comes in bands, and I've cut it into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 strips. So from 1 yard you get 6 yards, and by doing a design and actually facing them, a mirror image of each other, I've done a wonderful kind of garlanded floral arrangement. And you can also be a wonderful fairy princess with thousands of yards of circles of tulle cut, silk satin, and the lace is dyed a rich antique. You can just dip it in tea and then re-embroider it with your pearls and paillettes, and you can be the fairy princess on your wedding day.
We're in Victor Costa's Highland Park Boutique in Dallas, an entire store dedicated to dramatic special occasion gowns. The thing that excites me is that with Victor Costa's inspiration and the great tips he gave us on sewing with lace, as home sewers, we can create this kind of glamour for ourselves at home. Thank you so much, Victor.
Thank you, Nancy, for coming to my world.
After seeing Victor Costa's versatile use of lace, I'll bet you're as anxious as I am to make something lacy. Kenneth King is here to get us all started on sewing techniques with this always elegant fabric. But first, let's examine the construction of a close-fitted bodice. That's really the key to the smooth line you want to achieve in a finished garment.
Making a wedding gown can be a rewarding experience. It provides an opportunity for expressing your personality and talents. After choosing a pattern and fabric, you'll want to be certain that you will create a well-fitting and flattering gown. Let's see how we can make that happen. The caption on the back of the pattern envelope identifies this bodice as close-fitting. In the back of the pattern catalog is a chart which indicates there is little or no ease at the bust line in this pattern. With such a close-fitting shape, you may need to reevaluate your pattern size. Use guidelines to help you take measurements. Record bust, chest, waist, hip, back waist length, and height. Now compare bust measurement with the measurements in the standardized chart to determine your pattern size. When you get home with your pattern and have a chance to remove all the pieces from the envelope, you will find 3 fit guidelines on the bodice pieces. This symbol, O, marks the bust point. Near the symbol is the finished garment measurement for the bust area. In addition, a before you cut instruction reminds you what the pattern measures are for the style. If your measurements do not identically compare with your sized pattern, you may need to check a fitting text for adjusting information. Flat pattern measurements and adjustments can be statistically accurate, but they cannot accommodate your unique figure, including posture, weight distribution, and bone structure. These personal alterations need to be worked out in fittings, first with pattern pieces and then with the muslin. After drawing seam lines on your pattern pieces, pin them together and try them on for a half pattern pin fit. Keep adjusting your pieces until you are satisfied with this first fitting stage. With those pieces, make a fitting shell in less expensive fabrics that somewhat resemble the fabrics you will be using. For our sample garment, we used a medium weight muslin fabric for the satin bodice, pattern tracing cloth for the lace over bodice, and batiste for the tucked drape. Notice all the stitching lines, grain lines, and symbols are marked using a tracing wheel and dressmaker's tracing paper. The shell is sewn together with basting stitches for easy adjustments during a fitting, and it is stay-stitched to give accurate lines and prevent stretching along the outer edges. When the shell is on, we can check and perfect the fit. We can pin out excess length and fullness, adjust seams to eliminate wrinkles and pulling, and check for comfort. In addition to all of the fit information, we can check the scale and proportions, placement of details, and analyze how the overall style becomes the wearer. This inexpensive prototype is well worth the time and effort spent before cutting into elegant fabrics.
Well, now that Kenneth has showed you how to fit a bodice perfectly, that's a real basic thing to know, we're going to start with some of the other parts of this Victor Costa gown. It looks as though those are your sleeves cut out, right?
That's correct. We're starting with two different types of seams in lace. One stitched on the machine with a straight stitch and then a zigzag, the other stitched on the overlock machine with a 3-thread.
Which are you going to show us first?
First, we'll be starting with the straight stitch on the machine.
Okay, let's see.
For the straight stitch, you sew your seam, putting the cut edge of your lace on the 5/8 inch mark on your throat plate, like you would sew a normal seam. And I'm using a roller foot because there are no toes that will get caught on the lace. And what we'll be doing when we finish is to go back and 1/8 of an inch inside on the seam allowance, we'll do a small, tight zigzag. And if you notice, I'm raising the presser foot periodically because lace does have a tendency to stretch. And by raising the presser foot periodically, it helps even out the seam. Then you set the zigzag to 1 on the width and 1 on the length. And we go back 1/8 of an inch onto the seam allowance. And just zigzag along that seam. Finally, what you do is to trim off the excess fabric right close to the zigzag stitching, and you have your final seam. It's very small and very strong.
So that'll give you 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Obviously, we're using a contrasting thread so that you can see what we're doing. At home, you'd try to match the thread to the fabric.
This is the back side, and turning it to the outside.
Oh, I can
Once you
see.
steam and press it, it almost disappears.
Right, that's great.
So, once we have this finished, the next seam we're going to be sewing is very quick, very easy, and very transparent. And we do this with a 3-thread overlock stitch on the overlock machine.
Okay, let me watch that.
Put your cut edge on the guide mark on the machine and sew a seam. What this does is it sews the seam, cuts the seam allowances off, and finishes the seam all in one operation. So the seam itself is about 1/4 of an inch thick when it's done.
That was awfully quick. And it really does make a professional looking seam. I love the way it smooths it out so that it really encases all the stitches, doesn't it?
It does.
It's great.
What I'm going to be showing you next is what's called an applique seam. When you're working with lace, and especially a very nice lace that has a pattern, you really don't want to sew a straight seam into the lace. So the object of the game here is to make it look like the lace was woven into shape. How we do this is first, we lay out the patterns by drawing a motif of the lace onto the pattern pieces where the pattern pieces match. What this does is it ensures that the pattern will match all across the front of the lace. Once you've drawn this, what we'll be doing with some green basting thread is to trace out the seam lines onto the lace. Once the seam lines are marked, we'll go back with red basting thread and outline motifs outside of the seam line. And this will be a very irregular line because we're trying to outline a pattern. The next thing we do is cut out the pieces of lace, giving a little extra on the outside of the red thread tracing.
Which is your pattern, not your seam line.
Exactly. From there, we match up the green seam lines of both pieces. And as you can see through the lace that we have quite a distinct overlap. From here, we put a roller foot on the machine and we set the zigzag width to 1 and the length to 1. It's a very small, narrow zigzag, and proceed to outline around the edge of the motifs that we've outlined in red. And so the seam itself will be very curvilinear. The seam will follow the lace pattern all the way up. This takes a little bit of time.
Well, you really are following a very intricate pattern there, so you have to go in and out of each of the little crevices and around curves.
Correct. This is one of those things you do when you have very, very soothing music on your stereo.
Is it always a good idea to start with a new needle when you're working on fine fabrics?
Yes, any project, really. It's always a good idea to start with a fresh needle.
I know, sometimes we tend to be penny wise and pound foolish and take the chance of ruining something by not having all the equipment fresh, new, and best quality.
I love doing this.
Well, I can see that the trimming would be very important with all those little peaks and valleys that you've created there.
We go back in and pull out some of the thread basting.
And that's the red,
That's
the
red.
outer line, in
Yes.
other words, the motif tracing line.
We trim away the excess right up to the edge of the motif on the outside using our applique scissors. And from the underside, we trim out the excess so the seam itself is about 1/4 of an inch wide. So, now you can see right there on the back is where our zigzag is.
Can you show us yet what it looks like from the other side?
There it travels.
That's beautiful. In fact, if anything, where you do see the stitching thread, it almost looks like another little outline of a motif. That was some really good information, Kenneth. I guess we can all add the applique lace seam now to our bag of tricks. Terrific. What's next?
So, talking about bag of tricks, now comes the fun part. We're going to be embellishing a bodice. But first, to talk about some things to know before you embellish. As you can see, we have a full piece of fabric. We've marked our seam lines and our cutting lines onto the fabric with machine basting and darts and so forth. The reason we do this is that you would not embellish a pattern piece after it's cut out because you get a little bit of shrinkage. This way you can go back later and check against the pattern piece to make sure everything fits before you cut out.
Right, so you finish embellishing and then lay the pattern piece back down and see where you've ended up, right?
That's right.
Okay.
And as you can see, we've taken some lace motifs and we used our applique stitch from the last operation and made ourselves a lace motif around the neck.
Very pretty.
So then I've come in here with tracing paper and drawn some lines. For here we use the blue tracing paper, but when you would do this normally you would use white chalk. We use the blue for demonstration. And as you can see over here, when you have a motif passing across a seam line, you have to make sure that where it starts and ends matches up. Just little things to know.
Sure.
So today what we're going to be covering is, first we're going to be putting ribbon floss in the bobbin case.
Oh.
And second we're going to be doing stitching down beads.
Okay.
For the ribbon floss, what we need to do, we will be putting the ribbon floss in the bobbin case, which means the work will be on the machine face down.
Ooh, working blind.
No, not blind. We transfer our marks to the back side of the fabric.
I knew you'd have a solution to that.
This is our ribbon floss, and we wind a bobbin with the ribbon floss. And we'll be putting that in the bobbin case. The only variation is that you bypass the tension when you put the bobbin into the bobbin case.
Okay.
Then, once the bobbin is inserted into the machine, you bring the ribbon floss up just like you would any other thread.
That's great.
And now we're ready to work. We're using the open embroidery foot. We have the needle over to the far left position. We have the program on double stitch, and we're using the longest, the number 5 length stitch.
So you're really almost basting it on.
Almost. So this is how we set up the machine, and now we're going to begin. It takes 1 stitch every second stitch, and each time it takes a stitch, it picks up that ribbon floss. It's really essential when you're trying to make a lot of curves to get the machine going a little more slowly than you would normally sew. Even when you've had a lot of practice at this, it just takes a lot more time.
Does that give you added control?
It does. We're doing a double row here. So now, we'll take a peek.
Oh, that's beautiful. That is really wonderful.
And you notice we have the ends here. What you do with the ends is you would take them and put them in a large-eyed needle and pull them to the back of the fabric and secure it.
Kenneth, I've spent hours laboriously sewing on beads, sequins, seed pearls, that kinds of thing. I noticed that you're able to sew a whole line in almost no time. Show us how you do it.
Well, first we start with pre-strung beads, and we're using an iridescent bead today. And we've changed our foot to the bulky overlock foot. The bulky overlock foot was originally invented to sew thick knits and very heavy textured fabrics, but with a zigzag stitch, you can stitch on beads on a string. We're going to be following our pattern again, and the zigzag width is set on 2, and the stitch length is set on 2.2. And it's a simple matter of putting the strand of beads through the channel in the foot.
Now, I noticed that you left a few beads sticking out behind the presser foot.
Yes, that's to give you a little something to trim away, and it helps to get the row started. With these particular types, this particular type of bead, the beads are actually fused to the thread so they don't slip through. And as you can see, it just feeds right through the foot. It's very easy, very glamorous.
That is really amazing.
And here we are.
That's very pretty. Kenneth, show me how you're able to sew over the beads and attach them. I mean, there must be something very special about the foot.
Yes, the overlock foot has a channel right down the center that is large enough to allow the beads to pass through.
So the answer is modern technology. It really works great. These embellishments are so pretty and really not that difficult to do. You know, whenever I see a beautiful wedding gown, I fantasize about the day that my daughter Ingrid will be married wearing a dress that I've made for her special day. You may have some fantasies of your own when we meet pattern designer Reg Fairchild, who has some great ideas for customizing a Victor Costa wedding gown. But first, some preparation tips on lace that will assure your sewing success. Most laces have a net or mesh background with repeated motifs and finished borders. This construction allows you to work creatively with the design in the lace and cut the pieces lengthwise, crosswise, or favoring the motifs. Good quality laces are delicate with intricate designs. Some lace is available already embellished, or you may embellish by hand with pearls, beads, sequins, cord, or ribbons. The width of these laces is relatively narrow with ornate scallops and are most often used for panels, trimming, and applique. When they are cut through the center and around the motifs, elaborate mirrored borders are formed. All over lace patterns have repeated motifs throughout the yardage. Sometimes the motifs are dimensional and repetitive enough to be cut as a decorative edge treatment along the hem, neckline, or front opening. There's a wide range of domestic lace. Generally, it is flat, drapey, and easier to sew than the more delicate laces with fancy surface treatments. You need to look carefully to see if the lace you select has a one-way design requiring a with-nap layout. Now let's consider some lace layouts. We've covered our surface with felt, so the lace will lay flat and we can read the motifs. We have the sleeve and over-bodice pattern pieces for a Victor Costa gown, and have accompanied our pattern tissues with left side pieces of a sheer non-woven fabric for layout purposes. The pattern guide sheet shows one way of laying out the pattern pieces, but also advises us to be creative and show off the scallops and motifs of the lace. One option could be to place the front and sleeve edges along the scallops. When you make changes with patterns and layouts, however, you must realize that construction techniques may vary and require some research of sewing tips apart from your guide sheet. Rather than using the scallops, we're favoring the motifs, much as we would an uneven plaid. This layout requires adhering to the straight of grain and matching patterns on the crosswise. The outer edge may be finished with a scalloped border or an applique trim. See how we could curve this trim around the edge of the neckline. Some laces are fragile and may need some support. You could back them with tulle or netting to give nearly invisible body. You could also finish an edge with a strip of netting sewn the same way you would a piece of bias tape. For another effect, you could back the lace with an opaque fabric, such as satin, taffeta, or a silk crepe. Whether you're using lace for an entire gown or just a portion of it, let your pattern be a guide. But let the motif, scallops, lace weight, and density inspire you to create a special look.
The idea that there are no barriers, that when you yourself can create as the couturiers do, then you don't have any restrictions.
In this segment called Making It Yours, we turn our focus to customizing designs to best serve your figure, your lifestyle, and your personal style. So many of us tend to create a garment exactly as it's pictured, whether it be in the same fabric, the same print, or with all the elements shown. But you have the freedom to vary patterns, and so we're going to show you how we've adapted some designs to create entirely new looks. We earlier spoke to Victor Costa about his wonderful designs for special occasions, and there is no more special occasion than a wedding. The wedding dress is a personal reflection of the bride, and so customizing a dress to reflect one's own style is particularly valuable. Whether you sew the dress yourself or go to a dressmaker, you can work from these designer patterns to help you create your individual, unique dress. This is a Victor Costa wedding dress created directly from the pattern. It's a very beautiful traditional design with full lace sleeves, a satin bodice, and a full skirt flowing into a train. We called upon Reg Fairchild, design director for Vogue Patterns, to help us create a variation using this exact same pattern. Reg, can you show us what you've done to change this pattern?
Nancy, what we wanted to do was create a much more contemporary, modern look about this traditional design, while still keeping it uniquely Victor Costa, which is both beautiful and feminine.
This certainly is that.
And I'd like to show you a dress that we've created using this very same pattern. Again, the approach was to make it modern and to streamline it. So we've eliminated the lace across the bodice as it had in the original. We've eliminated the lace sleeve. We've streamlined the skirt and removed the train.
The detailing is really unique.
It truly is. It's a lattice treatment using self-fabric. And here at the shoulder, we've accentuated the sleeveless look about it with these self-fabric rosettes. It's a truly feminine look.
The whole look is more linear, as you mentioned, sleeker.
It is. It's much more modern while still being feminine. It accentuates the linear look of the body, accentuates the arm, along with the neckline here as well.
Well,
And
women
the-
spend a lot of time, working out these days. This dress is really going to show off her hard work.
Absolutely, and with the fitted bodice and the sleeveless arm and the beautiful revealing neck, it is both feminine and accentuates those qualities.
What about the use of color?
Well, this is a very unique color in bridal. It's a soft pink. Although not traditional, it's being used more and more often in pastel shades for bridal parties.
Well, it's amazing for me to see how you've created a completely different dress from the same pattern. Are there any other options?
What we've done for you today, Nancy, is we've created some illustrations that will show you how you can make this dress not only for bridal but for special occasion or daytime.
These are really completely different looks, Reg.
You know, the home sewer's options are limitless, and that, along with her creativity, she shouldn't be afraid to personalize a pattern. Like we've done here, we've taken your traditional bridal dress and turned it into an evening dress with the use of black lace, black taffeta, and these gold moire insets here. And also, on the note of special occasion, we've made it short and used a taffeta plaid here. And it even moves into daytime with the use of a cotton dot for a summer type of look.
Very, very versatile. I'd like to go back to evening. How about fabrics for evening and also color? Is black still the color of choice for nighttime?
Well, of course, for evening, black is always the best color. But red is another color that makes a fashion statement. It's also very striking. And we're starting to see chocolate brown move to the forefront, especially when it's mixed with coppers and bronzes.
This looks like this is a beautiful taffeta. What are some other fabrics that would work well for this?
The use of taffetas and moires and satin-backed crepes are always great for a traditional evening sort of look. And of course, you want to keep pattern in evening to a minimum. Solid is always best because it shows the detail in the silhouette much better. But as it moves into a special occasion or even into a daytime dress, you can bring in some of the more bold graphic plaids or even the dots.
Well, that's some very interesting news from the fashion front. Thanks so much, Reg.
Thank you.
I hope you've made lace work for you. And as Reg Fairchild suggests, remember to use your creativity. Consider the pattern as a starting point. Then incorporate your own ideas or techniques drawn from sewing books and magazines to make a special occasion dress that's truly an original. A young contemporary designer in the forefront today is Todd Oldham. In contrast to the delicate laces and more traditional styling preferred by Victor Costa, Todd Oldham pushes color and textures to the limits. Here now is the best of our Sewing Today program with Todd Oldham. Welcome to Sewing Today. Like most of us who sew, you probably learned some basic rules about what colors, textures, and prints work together. Well, today, New York's hot young designer, Todd Oldham, will show us that we really can throw out a lot of the old rules in order to create some terrific fashion. We'll find out how to make Todd Oldham's signature patchwork fabric. Kenneth King, our expert sewing instructor, is here to give us a lesson in sewing popular sheer fabrics. And we'll learn how special buttons and buttonholes combine to add designer dash to your wardrobe. We'll see how this Todd Oldham pattern can give you a completely different look. But first, let's meet Todd. If you're lucky, you might spy him rummaging through New York City's funky East Village. Todd Oldham is one of the hottest young designers. He's really known for his unusual combinations of color, pattern, silhouette. I'd say you have almost a cult-like following. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, we have some very nice loyal fans. I'm happy for that.
You know, I understand that we have something in common, that your grandmother also taught you how to sew. How old were you then?
I think it was about 9. Did yours teach you to sew too?
Before I can even remember, I think.
Wow. Yeah, my grandmother and my mom spent a lot of time, but they taught us how to do everything, you know, all sorts of crafts, building houses, making lamps, and actually it really all applies to sewing.
Were your mother and grandmother also responsible for your love of vintage clothing and crafts?
I think that's pretty much something I cultivated on my own, but we've always shopped in thrift stores and garage sales, been big fans of sort of digging through the garbage and seeing what someone else threw away. It's amazing what you can redo with stuff. And I grew up in a pretty big family, and in order to keep a lot of kids corralled and happy, Mom spent a lot of time with us teaching us how to do everything.
And making do. You learn how to do that in a
absolutely.
big family.
Exactly. And I mean, that's all. It doesn't occur to me to go out and buy something first. It's like, well, how do I make it? And then if I can't make it, I go buy it.
What about your buttons, which are available now to the home sewer? What was your inspiration for beginning a button collection?
Well, we make all of our own buttons on both my X7 shirt line and my collection, and we wanted to do that so that we could offer sort of very singular special closures. We've made them out of glass, we cast them in white metal, we've even made them out of twigs we found on the ground. So it was just sort of having the ingenuity to want to create something special, but you can either purchase the buttons that we offer for the home sewing trade, but I encourage people to make them out of bottle caps or the twigs, rocks, whatever you'd like to do.
Or find them on other old clothing.
Exactly, cut them off. I mean, if it fits through a buttonhole, it's a button.
That's true. I understand that you launched your first sportswear line by dyeing something like 40 yards of fabric in your own bathtub. Have you taken any other unconventional approaches to fashion?
At the very beginning, it was my very first collection, and I didn't know what to do. No one wanted to work with me. It was like Todd Who. And I wanted very specific colors and to do specific things. So I found white cotton t-shirt knit and got in the bathtub with gifts of dye my grandmother bought me, and I had gray up to here. Look, I had opera gloves on for about a half a year. But I was able to get what I wanted, and I think that thought process is really important when people are working with patterns at home, is, think about what the end result is and then go about simplifying the route.
Well, I think there's a really good lesson in that if you can't either afford it or find exactly what you want, the sewer shouldn't be afraid to create something on her own.
Absolutely not. Even if it's as simple as, I know patterns can be really daunting. You open those up and there's thousands of pieces of tissue. But depending on how skilled you are, even if you just want to make the shell of your jacket and leave the inside unlined, that works. I mean, ultimately you have to be happy in it, so that's all that matters.
So take some chances or feel that you're the one who's in command.
Oh, absolutely. And if you like the top half of an old shirt, why not cut it off and attach a skirt to it, make a dress? I mean, recycle those old things too.
You know this because you're really a sewer, and not all designers are.
Yes, I'm very happy to know that. I'm not exactly sure how a designer could design without knowing that, but I know it helps me endlessly to know that. I also make all my own patterns, so when I see a jacket in mind, I see every step it takes to get to the end.
Todd, they say that a person's workspace tells you a lot about them. What do you think that this space tells us about you? Oh,
that's a very frightening thought, isn't it? Well, I'm really not as messy as this looks, but I think it's important to have your surroundings, mirror your interest and your ideas. I find it really inspirational. It's pictures of my friends or pals, or I love the barrage of color, and I think people should, pretty much, if you can find a little private special space in your home even, it's nice to have those muses around you to help the inspiration go.
A sheer fabric can create a soft, feminine look or a hip, new look, as we just saw. Today, expert sewing instructor Kenneth King will take the fear out of working with shears when he shows us how to make the flawless seams and hems that will give your sheer garments a professional designer finish. But first, let's find out how to combine fabrics and decorative stitching to create the patchwork fabric that Todd Oldham has popularized. Todd Oldham's approach to mixing fabrics and colors is an inspiration to anyone. Don't be afraid to mix fabrics, tapestries, brocades, silks, or damasks to create your own pieced or patchwork fabrics. This designer encourages you to break the rules, to experiment and take chances. Stripes can be used both horizontally and vertically. Combine a large-scale print with an overall design, or an even larger print with a muted stripe. Why not try using both the right and wrong sides of the fabric, too? And remember, fabrics such as velveteen, velvets, or corduroy look quite different depending on which direction you sew the nap. Oldham is currently working with strip piecing techniques in his vests and jackets. You can literally create your own fabric using this strip piecing method. Select your favorite Oldham pattern and fabrics for piecing. Cut a shell of pre-washed muslin of all pattern pieces that are to be strip pieced. Place all the necessary markings on the muslin pieces. Cut strips from your chosen fabrics in any width you want. Select your favorite fabric strip for the center front and work from the center out, seaming with the patchwork foot. From center needle position to the edge of the foot is exactly 1/4 inch. Once the first strip has been stitched, add the next strip and stitch the seam. Press each seam to the side and continue to complete the piece. After you have completed each section, place the original tissue pattern over the strip piecing and cut around the shape again. Before you stitch darts or sew the side seams, you can add trims or embellish with decorative stitches of your choice on the right side. Why not try feather stitches with a metallic thread or any of the other crazy quilt stitches that today's machines provide? Now complete stitching the garment according to the pattern instructions. Be creative. Scout vintage shops, your grandmother's attic, or your own fabric stash. Have fun mixing and matching types and weights of fabrics. And don't forget to have fun with the linings, too. Sewing with shears can be a bit tricky, but are they really that difficult to handle? Sewing Today's expert sewing instructor, Kenneth King, is here today to answer all of our questions about sewing with shears. I'd like to know what we should know first. What's most important?
Most important for a successful project is to start with the proper equipment. It hinges on a really fine needle. A 60/8 is always good. And some machines have a straight stitch throat plate that has a single hole where the needle passes through.
So what's the advantage of a straight stitch throat plate over a standard throat plate?
The small hole in the straight stitch throat plate keeps the fabric from being caught into the feed dogs, and this ensures smooth feeding through the machine.
I can see how that would really come in handy. So what's next? What do we need to know?
What's next? We start with accurate pinning. What I generally do is to pin in the seam allowances, and this keeps the pin holes from showing later after you've stitched the seam.
That's right, because often you can't even steam out pinholes
That's
in
correct.
sheer fabric.
So what we're going to be sewing first today is a standard zigzag seam. We start by stitching a standard 5/8 inch seam, but first we set the machine on the zigzag stitch, the width being 1, the stitch length being 1. This is going to be a very short, narrow zigzag.
Now, why do you choose a zigzag over a straight stitch on a shear?
On a shear, a lot of times the fabric tends to stretch over time, and if you were to use just a standard straight stitch, the seam would drag up when the fabric stretched. Also, if you're stitching on a bias that has a natural stretch, this seam gives it a lot more elasticity. What we're going to be doing after this is to come along the seam allowance to stitch a second row of zigzagging, and the second row will be slightly wider and slightly longer. That will act as the seam finish, and the two of these combined will make quite a strong seam.
Is this a technique that sewers might want to keep in mind if they're making lingerie?
Exactly. And here we are.
Oh, that's great, and no pucker at all. That's wonderful.
Once we have this seam stitched, we go back to the machine and just adjust the stitch width to 175 and the length to 1/5. The second row of stitching goes in 1/8 of an inch onto the seam allowance.
So you're able to use your first seam then as a guide for the
Correct.
second.
After we've done the double row of stitching, we go to the pressing table to press.
And what temperature do you use with this particular shear?
This is a silk setting, as it's a silk fabric. After pressing the seam flat with the iron, we place the seam on the cutting mat, line up the ruler with the outside row of stitching, and with the rotary cutter, trim off the excess. Once the seam is trimmed, go and press. The seam obviously will be pressed to one side.
So that's the zigzag seam technique. What other seams work well with sheer fabrics?
I'm sure you've heard of the classic French seam,
Yes.
where the wrong sides of the fabric are put together. The seam is stitched 3/8 of an inch from the raw edge. It's trimmed close to the stitching. Everything is turned right sides together and pressed, and then the final seam is put in.
Right, that way all the raw edges are encased in the final seam.
Exactly. We have an updated technique that uses the overlock machine to do the same thing, and this eliminates trimming the seam, so
Let's
it's a
see how it
lot
works.
quicker. We first stitch the first seam on the 3/8 inch mark of the overlock machine. We're using a rolled hem stitch, and what's happening here is that the seam is being sewn and finished and trimmed all in one operation.
So you're eliminating one whole step.
Exactly. Once we have the seam finished, as you can see, it's all clean and tidy. We press it flat. After pressing the seam to one side, and it will find the side it wants to go to dependent on the seam, fold the fabric in half, placing the right sides together. Once this is pressed, we'll be ready to do our final seam. Now at the sewing machine, we use the edge stitching foot and move the needle to the far left position. And this is the final seam that we sew for this particular French seam.
So you're sewing about, what would you say, an eighth of an inch?
Eighth of an inch, yes. And using the edge stitching foot and moving the needle over gives you the exact distance you need to finish this perfectly. And there you have it.
Very nice.
A final press to open the seam, and it'll be finished.
If you've ever tried to hand roll a hem on sheer fabric, you realize it can take forever. So Kenneth has some real time-saving techniques for you today.
First, we're going to be starting with a stitched and turned hem. The process on this is, as you can see, I've done a line of stay stitching where the hem is to be rolled. Next, we're going to fold along the stitching line and press in place.
And that stitching line is at 5/8 inch, is that correct?
Yes, but this would depend on where you want the hem to fall. If this were along the bottom of a garment, you would mark the hem first. Okay, we come over to the machine, and with the edge stitching foot, we move our needle over to the far left, and we stitch. And this stitching line will occur about an eighth of an inch from the folded edge. Once we're done with this, we trim the excess close to that line of stitching.
What's the function of the second line of stitching?
The second line of stitching holds the folded edge down because we're going to be rolling and folding one more time and stitching so that all of the raw edges will be encased. Once this is trimmed, we press down again.
So you're just pressing both lines of stitching flat at this time.
Exactly. Once this is pressed, keeping everything the same on the machine, we go back.
You're stitching over the existing row of stitching.
Exactly. When you use matching thread, the two rows of stitches will read as one.
Well, there we have it, a stitched and turned hem. What's next?
We have the triple needle lingerie hem. As you can see, I've marked the fold line with silk basting.
Why do you use the silk?
When you press, silk thread doesn't leave enormous holes. We fold along the line of basting stitches and press. This will be the folded edge of our hem. Once this is done, we take it to the machine. The machine is using a triple lingerie needle, which is threaded with 3 different spools of thread. We stitch down using the inside toe as a guide so that the stitch is roughly 1/16 of an inch from the folded edge of the hem.
When you're using the triple needle, Kenneth, what kind of plate do you use?
If you've been using your straight stitch plate, make sure you change the plate back to the zigzag plate.
So you can that.
Otherwise you'll break needles. And we're at the end of our seam.
Oh, that's amazing.
And now our final step is to trim away the seam allowance.
So turned and stitched or lingerie hem, two wonderful ways to work with shears when you get to the hemming point. We're going to revisit Todd Oldham and learn how to be more adventurous when mixing colors and prints. But first, let's take a closer look at one of Todd Oldham's signature designer elements, buttons and buttonholes. With the advent of his sportswear line, Todd Oldham's signature great white shirt was introduced. But in typical Oldham styles, the classic and understated shirt was simply a canvas for his entertaining buttons. Todd Oldham has designed a line of buttons available to you that include motifs of dogs and dog bones, with jewels, of course, timepieces, teapots, fruits and vegetables, and handbags and shoes. The more humorous, the better. Oldham's inspirations for his buttons and clothes are from thrift stores, vintage home furnishings, people on the street, and his penchant for arts and crafts. Personalize your own shirt with interesting buttons from the attic or flea markets, or handcrafted buttons such as coins or silver. The number of buttons on a garment may be changed. The front of a shirt may have 12 buttons, 5 that actually button, and the remaining buttons sewn on for novelty. Cuffs look good with more than one button. Small buttons may be clustered in groups of 3. Oldham says, "What I love about my buttons is that they make perfect decoys if you make a mistake. They're great at covering up the bruises." A buttonhole can be anything but an ordinary buttonhole. Creative closures are an interesting way to add detail to spare shapes. Here you see loop buttonholes made out of a contrasting fabric-covered cotton cable. Oldham's jewel and gold buttons make an outstanding statement. Bound buttonholes don't have to match either the garment or each other. Here striped fabric was selected, one cut on the bias and one cut on the straight of grain. The size has been slightly upscaled, and the final effect is very Todd Oldham. Bound objects can lead you to unique ideas. Ordinary brass toggle hooks are attached to the fabric with faux suede strips and covered with Oldham jeweled buttons to form a contemporary version of the traditional frog. As you could probably tell, it was a real treat for me to meet Todd Oldham. Not only is he extremely creative, but his style can be easily interpreted into your own sewing. He's the kind of designer who will inspire young people to sew. A designer that has been well respected for his structured and elegant styling is Bill Blass. Fabric is a key element in determining the pattern you choose and the success of your sewing project. Here now are some sewing secrets from Bill Blass. Welcome to Sewing Today. In this program, we're going to focus on designer Bill Blass. We'll meet Mr. Blass in his New York studio and learn about his approach to fashion design, which can be called structured. We'll show the process of attaching facings and linings for a polished finish. Our expert sewing instructor, Kenneth King, will take us step-by-step through the construction of patch pockets. We'll look inside a Bill Blass dress and discuss hemming techniques for a lined garment. And we'll demonstrate the versatility of this Bill Blass suit. A change of accessories can totally change the look. But first, let's meet Mr. Blass. Bill Blass, just the mention of his name conjures up images of the most elegant styles, the most exquisite detailing, and the most luxurious fabrics. 3-time Coty Award winner. In fact, he's a member of the Coty Hall of Fame. He's one of America's most celebrated designers, and why not? He makes American women feel beautiful.
Well, I think that's part of our job, really, that we want to enhance the woman. After all, I still feel a person isn't well-dressed if they turn around and see what you're wearing, but if they turn around and see how you look, then you are.
Bill, your fans include people like Barbara Bush, Nancy Kissinger, Mary Tyler Moore, Barbara Walters, Candice Bergen, the list just goes on and on. You seem to take the whole woman into consideration, not just the clothes she's wearing. What can we all learn from that approach?
Well, what I learned from it, and I'm still doing it, is I go on the road. I don't think the designer should just stay here in New York in some sort of ivory tower. I go out on the road and see actually how the customer lives and how she wants to look for the life she leads. And I do know most of my customers personally.
Do you have any advice or some specific information that pertains to the client, the woman who's in the mature category? What should
well, now are we talking about the more mature woman who in size or in age? Because today there isn't anybody really much over 36 as far as they're concerned. Everybody tries to take care of their body and wants to look as good as possible. But I do think that the one thing you keep in mind is the clothes that you feel at ease in and that don't overpower you. Too often a designer tends to make clothes for the model and not for the actual woman.
You turn out chic, crisp collections every year and really use color wonderfully. What should we, when we're sewing, think about when we're choosing a fabric to go with a pattern?
Well, here again, I think that it's a mistake to think, despite the fact that this season has never been blacker, and that most people in New York wear black. In this vast country, American women love color. Men like color, like to see their women in color. Choose a color that's becoming to you, and particularly if you're a home sewer, you have a marvelous chance to really and truly express yourself in the color and fabric that you wear, that you choose.
What about the way the fabric feels on your body?
It should be light. I'm a firm believer that most of the country is warm more than it is cold for the most part, and you want clothes that are light and feel comfortable on your body.
Bill, you mix fabrics like denim and velvet, tweeds with herringbone plaids. Any suggestions for us in combining fabrics for a Bill Blass look?
I think that you can't just let the woman decide that for herself. I think you should make a suggestion. We don't dictate anymore. We simply propose.
What about timelessness in a garment? What would you describe as the American classics?
Well, it starts with sportswear. In a sense, and in a real sense, we invented sportswear in this country. It wasn't really invented in Europe at all. It was here. And that's still the one thing that we do in America, I think, better than anybody else. And that's classic. It really and truly is. It's as classic as a man's suit, which hasn't changed in decades.
If we're going to spend a lot of time making a jacket, we want something we can wear for lots of occasions. For work, perhaps to throw over jeans on weekends, to combine with some elegant evening pants for evening wear. What kind of fabric, what kind of line, silhouette would you choose?
Well, obviously you don't want to work in brocades or something that is totally inappropriate for daytime, but you can certainly do it in a color that would be mixed with, as you say, with a pair of velvet pants to wear on to dinner or something of that sort. But that could be tweed or wool of almost any sort, or silk, depending on where you live in the climate.
I heard once that Chanel said fashion changes, style remains.
Absolutely.
Do you agree?
Chanel made some great statements about fashion. She was a classic designer as well, you know. And she certainly in her time, she revolutionized fashion, and she would be delighted to know that her name is still more powerful today.
Thank you so much. I know we've learned a lot from you.
Nice to be with you.
A significant detail featured on Bill Blass designs are patch pockets. Kenneth King is here to give us a lesson in constructing these lined pockets, but first let's find out how easy it is to sew inside and outside curves on facings and linings. Today we're going to be working with inner and outer curve seams on this Bill Blass dress. There are inner curves for the dress and facing, and inner and outer curves to be seamed for the facing and lining. After cutting out all the pattern pieces, interface the facings and stabilize the curved edges with stay stitching. Stay stitch the neck edge of the lining to prevent stretching and to provide an accurate stitching line. Stitch directionally from shoulder to center front and then from shoulder to center backs. Sew your shoulder seam. Press the seam flat to set it. Then press your seams open over a sleeve roll. Baste a line along the outer curve of the facing. Put in the zipper at this point and proceed with the facing application. Then pin in the facing starting at the center front, match your shoulder seams, and now you're ready to start sewing. Now that the neck seam is complete, trim and grade by cutting your seam approximately in half. After cutting through all the layers, go back and trim away a little bit more of your facing and interfacing to grade the neckline seam. Clip the seams, snip the bulk at the seam allowances, and begin understitching the seam allowances to the facing using the edge stitch foot. Press the understitch neck edge, pin the outer curve facing to the inner curve lining matching the shoulder seams at the center front. Pin from the lining side. There are two ways to proceed from this point. Continue with the pattern instructions by basting the clipped seam allowance toward the inside, then slip stitching the lining to the facing. Turn the edge in at the stay stitch line. Baste to secure lining to facing using the stay stitch line as a guide. Hand stitch the slip stitched lining to the back. At center back, fold in the edges and turn in to meet the center of the zipper. Or the lining can be attached by machine. Here the facing and lining have been joined and turned under to meet the center of the zipper tape. Then hand stitch with a slip stitch joining the edge of the lining and the center of the zipper tape. A properly constructed lining can enhance the total look of your garment. As I'm sure you've noticed, this Bill Blast jacket features some wonderful patch pockets as a detail, and our expert sewing instructor, Kenneth King, is here today to show us how to make perfect patch pockets. Say that a few times. Where do you start, Kenneth?
Well, Nancy, what we're going to be demonstrating today is two versions of a lined patch pocket. What I like to do first is make a duplicate of the pattern piece onto the graph paper. And then drawing this line, this will represent the top edge of the pocket and the fold line, and the area here will represent the facing piece.
The self-facing.
Yes.
So you use this as your pattern piece?
No, actually, that was for demonstration.
Oh, okay.
I prepared another piece and folded the pattern piece along the folding line, which will create the facing. What we're going to be doing now is making a template, which we'll use to shape the pockets later. For that, we use our tracing wheel set on the 5/8 inch mark and tracing paper, and we run all along the outer edges.
Okay, what's next? I'll get that out of your way.
Now, as you can see, we've already cut out our pattern pieces. One out of the fabric and one out of a lining. And we have the option at this point to interface or not interface. The decision here is whether the pocket is decorative or whether it's going to be functional. We've decided on this sample that it's going to be decorative. You interface it when you're receiving heavy use.
The kinds that you put your hands in a lot.
Exactly.
All right, well, these are mostly decorative, so I guess we don't need the interfacing.
Right, we've chosen not to use it today. So once we've done that, now we start construction. But first, I like to finish the edges of self-facing by cutting a bias strip of China silk and then stitching down 1/4 inch along the facing edge and pressing over.
This looks like it's about what, 1 1/4 inches, or
This
what
is
would
1
you
1/4, 1 1/2.
Okay.
So this is what this is what's called a Hong Kong finish. We'll be pressing this seam allowance around to the back, and then after we press, we'll stitch with the top stitching foot right along in that seam. From here, we take it to the pressing table, and we'll actually be pressing down the other edge to finish up that raw edge. After the strip is pressed to the back, now we're ready to go to the machine and stitch it in place.
So you can do a little stitch in the ditch.
Exactly. We're using an edge stitching foot and contrasting red thread so that we can see what's happening.
That looks like a finished pocket.
It's not quite finished yet. The next thing we'll be doing is fastening the facing down to the front of the pocket. But first we change our foot
To just a standard foot.
to the standard foot and fold over, and we can just attach it with machine basting.
And you're basting at the seam line.
No, actually I'm basting a
little bit
1/2 inch
inside.
in. Now we're ready for our lining. What we have here is our lining piece that we've cut out. We've cut off the facing portion because this will go just to the upper edge of the pocket.
Right.
And stay stitched along this line 1/4 inch. And then we're doing what's called favoring, and that involves trimming 1/8 inch off along this entire edge. What that will do in the finished product is make the lining smaller than the pocket outside, and the seams will fall to the back.
So you'll never see a little bit of that lining peeking out.
That's correct.
Not what we want to see. All
So
right.
then we attach the lining to the pocket.
All right, I'll take
And we
these out of
start
your way,
pinning.
and you can see the in progress
In
pocket
progress,
here.
yes, here we are. So we're pinning, lining up our cut edges. And if you notice, the outer pocket curls slightly, and that's what's supposed to happen.
Because you've cut an 1/8 of an inch all the way around, right?
Exactly. So now we go back to the machine and stitch. And since this is a 5/8 inch seam, I like to use the guideline on the throat plate of the machine. I find that this is a lot more accurate.
Now again, when you're pinning parallel to the outer edge, you have the head of the pin pointing toward you so that you can remember to take it out each
Exactly.
time you approach it.
And by using the pins in this manner and judging with your eye to the cut edge on the mark on the throat plate,
Yes.
you can get a good accurate curve. Now when you're coming to the curves, it's best to shorten your stitch to about, 20 to the inch.
Quite a small stitch.
Quite a small stitch. And if you notice, I lift the presser foot every now and then to relieve tension on the fabric. This also helps to make a smoother curve. And then again, back to the
Now that you're on the straightaway, you go back to the standard stitch?
Yes, and that's about 12 stitches to the inch.
And always fasten down. I guess that's pretty much a rule of thumb that everyone
Yes,
realizes. All right.
and it's
now-
starting to look like a pocket.
Yes, it is.
So here we are. We have our finished pocket. And trim the seam allowances first.
And what amount are you trimming? It looks like you're leaving about a 1/4 of an inch?
1/4 of an inch. On this particular lining, it works best to trim equally. The lining is very thin and there is a minimum show through. So once we have our seam allowances trimmed, we clip the corners. And as you can see, I've already gone around and clipped most of them. And you just make little V-shaped notches, like so,
Just around the curved edge.
just around the curved edge.
You can actually use the areas where you have the smaller stitches as a guide for your clipping, right?
Exactly. And another reason you would shorten your stitches is to prevent, if you got the clip too close to the stitching, this way it would prevent that seam from
Yes.
bursting. And now we start the unveiling. Turn our pocket right side out.
That's a nice soft curve.
This is where our template comes in. Remember we made that with the
Yes,
manila
with the
envelope?
manila tag board.
We've cut this out, and we use that as a pressing guide.
Oh, all right.
Slip this into the pocket, and if you notice, all of the seam allowances show. All of the seam allowances are on the lining side.
Yes.
And what this does is gives us a good, consistently shaped pocket when we're pressing. This is good if you want to make multiples of pockets for a jacket. Each pocket will be uniform.
This is also a really good chance to show how the favoring works. You see a little bit of the blue fabric all the way around the edge.
Exactly. So once the paper is in, we press. Once pressed, pull the paper out, and voila,
There it is.
there it is.
One more step, I can tell.
Our next step is then to turn the self-facing to the inside and nudge the corners in place with a point presser.
That's a handy tool, isn't it?
It really is. Once this is done, the facing itself is pressed in place.
Do you need to finish the pocket in any way at this point?
Yes, it's always advisable to slip stitch underneath the fold here to join the facing to the lining of the pocket.
And then what?
Well, once we have that done, we're ready to join the pocket to the body of the piece. You notice that we have tailor's tacks here for alignment of the pocket. The pocket itself has been basted down, and now we're going to be top stitching the pocket down to the piece with the edge stitching foot.
So you have to change feet.
Correct. So we start first by putting the needle in the fabric and hitting the reverse button. And this will reinforce the stitches. And now we can go forward.
And this is when an edge stitching foot is so handy because you can't see a seam guideline underneath the material, obviously.
Exactly. And edge stitching is so crucial because if it's not straight, it really doesn't look tidy.
Well, especially when we're using contrasting thread, it shows everything. And we're using the same size stitch all the way around the pocket. There's no need to tighten down because that would be too obvious, right?
Correct. Yeah, having the right tool really makes quick work of doing pockets. And this foot really is one of the favorites in my sewing box. And then we back up.
Again, to strengthen the corners.
Exactly. And we're done.
All right. A finished pocket. Kenneth, what's different about the second method of pocket construction? Where do you begin?
Well, we begin with the pattern. You generally get a pattern that provides for a separate lining piece and self-faced pocket. What we've done here is to cut out the pocket and the lining, and as you notice, we've interfaced the pocket because this will receive heavy use. First step is to attach the lining piece to the pocket piece. At the long seams, first by pinning, just to keep it in place, and then we stitch.
And that's the standard seam allowance?
Standard 5/8.
One thing I guess we should mention is that when you are interfacing, you should always steam the interfacing to make sure that it doesn't shrink differently than your fabric.
Exactly. And you notice I'm stopping and moving over 1.5 to 2 inches. This will create the opening that will provide the access to turn the pocket when it's complete. So.
All right, and the next step?
Yes. This is where we are now. We have our opening, and we'll press all seam allowances to the lining side. Once this is done, we'll be pinning our raw edges together as we did for the last pocket.
Right, so you're pinning both the straight and the curved, and you're using the pin basting technique.
Exactly.
So that shows your stitching line, or the beginning of a stitching line, and here we have one that's completely, or nearly finished.
Nearly finished, yes. As you can see while I'm pinning, the pocket cups slightly, and this is because we've trimmed off 1/8 of an inch around the edges of the lining for favoring. Once again, back to the machine. It's always a good idea to backstitch on the corners so that they'll remain secure. And the pins also are run parallel to the seam, and this functions in place of basting. And on the curves, again, we shorten the stitch to about 22 to the inch to make it easier to make a smooth curve, as well as protecting the seam later when we clip. You Notice that periodically I'll be lifting the presser foot up, and this helps to get around the curve more smoothly. And again, backstitch. And we have our seam.
I know that you have one ready that you've progressed to the next stage, which is the trimming and the clipping phase.
Yes, we've trimmed and we've clipped the curves. At this point, we turn the pocket through the opening that we've provided at the facing.
Okay, now that's what's really unique about this pocket. Any hints on how to get a nice sharp corner and turn on a pocket like this?
Well, once the pocket is turned right side out, you take your point turner and put it inside, and the point turner, the curved end of the point turner helps you to get a proper curve on the bottom corners of the pocket, and the pointed edge gives you proper corners at the top corners. When you're pressing, roll the edge of the pocket towards the lining so that the fashion fabric is visible. This will enhance the favoring. And voila,
There
a
it
finished
is.
pocket.
Now, do you close up? Yes.
Yes, we have the opening here, and with a needle and thread, just slip stitch it by hand, and the pocket is ready to be attached to the jacket.
Well, let's show how we do that.
We have the pocket positioned with our tailor's tacks and a few pins, and what we're going to be demonstrating now is how to pick stitch the pocket with the blind hem stitch on your machine.
Oh.
What you do now is change your foot to the edge stitch, edge stitching foot. First, we put the machine on the blind hem setting. We then move the needle one notch to the left. We narrow the zigzag, and we shorten the stitch.
And we're ready to
And we're
go.
ready to go. And what happens is the guide travels right along the edge of the pocket, and the needle swings over just enough to grab the pocket. And the effect it creates is that of a hand-picked pocket.
It certainly does. It looks as though it's hand-stitched, but by someone with a very good eye, perfectly even stitches.
We're coming to the end of our pocket.
Kenneth, that looks wonderful. You would never guess that it was done by machine. It's a perfect technique. That's that great Bill Blass red. And now that we know how to perfectly line a pocket, we're going to find out how to attach a lining to a hem. Linings are used for comfort, to prolong the life of the garment, and to reduce wrinkling. Before a lining is attached, the hem length must be established and finished. After the hem is established, baste a thread close to the edge to hold it in place. Then serge around the bottom to finish the edge neatly. Smooth the lining over the dress fabric. Place pins vertically about 6 inches from the bottom edge to hold the lining to the dress. Mark about 5 inches from the bottom of the lining. Pinch a 1/4 inch of fabric and pin a small tuck or jump pleat. Turn up approximately a 1/4 inch and slip stitch the lining to the hem. Release pins and you now have a jump pleat. For a 1 inch free hanging hem, press in a 1/4 inch. Then lightly press up 3/4 inch and pin. The edge stitch foot works well because I'm able to get really close. Use the guide. Now I'm going to show you how to attach your lining by using a serge thread chain to be used as a French tack. Once you've made your serger chain, thread a large-eyed needle with that serger chain and not the end. Attach the lining to the hem and try to get right into the point where you pick up the thickest part of the lining and work through. And then go back through, make a knot, and cut it off. No serger? To make an old-fashioned traditional French tack by hand, go back and forth 2 to 3 times with a threaded needle and make a blanket stitch line, pointing away from you and drawing through. When complete, go back through one more time and tie down, not by making a stitch, pulling it through, and cutting it off. We hope you've learned some ways to make this beautifully structured garment work for you, and that meeting Bill Blass has been inspiring. From the elegance of Bill Blass, we now move to the fine couturier detailing of Geoffrey Beene. Mr. Beane's attention to detail makes a garment extra special. Let's see how easy it is for you to transfer Geoffrey Beane's ideas to your own sewing from the best of Sewing Today. Welcome to Sewing Today. Today we feature Geoffrey Beene, a designer who has always stretched the boundaries of fashion by experimenting with cut, fabric mixes, and unusual approaches to seams. We'll look closely at some of the couture details featured in Mr. Beane's clothing when we examine a knit jersey neck binding and when Sewing Today's expert instructor, Kenneth King, demonstrates techniques for enhancing curved seams with piping, cording, and tubing. We'll take the intimidation out of top and edge stitching, and you'll also see how just 2 patterns create a designer wardrobe. But first, let's meet one of the deans of American design, Geoffrey Beene. Geoffrey Beene is the American master of superbly constructed clothes, always feminine, never demure. The winner of 8 Coty Awards, he was the first American designer invited to show in Japan and Europe. He's revered by his colleagues and adored by his clients. Mr. Beene has some very strong feelings about the clothes he designs and the way women should wear them. Welcome to Sewing Today. I understand that there are 3 items that you feel are indispensable to every woman's wardrobe, Mr. Beene.
Indeed, one and most important is the jumpsuit, which is one piece of clothing with one zip, and to me is the most useful piece of clothing. The jacket to go over that, and the jacket can go over the jumpsuit. And then if you don't wish pants, there's a skirt. So it's a jumpsuit, skirt, and jacket. And then you add to and take from that.
You have a proven ability to simplify clothing, cutting as few seams as possible. How does that work for us when we make our own Geoffrey Beene?
Well, the fewer seams, the quicker the garment will be made. But assuming that they're like seams you've always had, but they are not necessarily that way. The seams are often curved, or indeed are not side seams, which sometimes bisect the body. A lot of my seams either go forward or go backwards, embracing the body rather than bisecting.
You mentioned the curved seam, and a fashion story in the New York Times stated that your curved seam does for fashion today what Viennese bias cut did for fashion in the 1930s. What impact do you think the curved seam has had?
They help bring about a more sensuous aspect of the body.
What about fabrics to choose when you are doing some innovations in your seaming?
Well, I mean, fabrics are the dictate to all of fashion and indeed sewing. So the ideal fabric to me, if I did nothing but make a whole collection in jersey, wool jersey, matte jersey, any jersey in the world, I'd be content, because you have fewer seams again, because there's stretch to wool jersey, and that's the secret to stretch, is eliminating seams. Jersey is my favorite fabric. It can define a body, or it can even be tailored by definition. It does everything.
In addition to innovative approaches to fashion, you have had a reputation for such an innovative approach to shows. They almost approach performance art at times.
I just simply got tired of showing the catwalk models on the catwalk, and it seemed like half the time was spent in seeing their backs. And unless you're really It's good design. Fashion should be good at all levels, and so I turned it into theater.
It seems almost impossible, but you are able to be innovative and yet timeless. How do you manage to create that balance or to achieve what would seem impossible?
I've often thought about that, and if I knew how to bring that about, I probably wouldn't tell, because I wouldn't have a job.
Well, we think you do it, and that's what I guess is also important. Mr. Bean, you're not a proponent of the big ball gown. How do you like to see women dressed for evening?
Actually, I prefer one piece of clothing, like this jumpsuit. It's one zip, and that's it. This one is covered with a jacket, which is quite dressy, but anything could go over it, a sweater, a jacket, a bolero, it doesn't matter. It has great versatility and does not have the demands that a very precious ball gown has.
I love the idea that it's also comfortable. You could wear it with flat shoes. You're going to be perhaps standing through cocktails, sitting through dinner, sitting through a concert, and then on to the ball. So this gives you something you can really wear all evening comfortably.
Well, in that sense, I guess it has sort of athletic connotations. It moves easily, it's modern, and you don't have to worry about it so much.
Mr. Bean, how would you describe your personal fashion trademark?
It's difficult to make that judgment oneself, but the intent is to simplify clothing, make it more modern, more versatile, light in weight, that it doesn't wrinkle, all those factors that help accommodate a society that is very quick-paced.
Mr. Bean, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Kenneth King has some great techniques for accomplishing a couture look when we accentuate design lines with cording, piping, and tubing. But first, let's see how a knit binding can add the perfect finish to a simple jewel neckline.
The versatile bias binding was designed to enclose raw edges, thus providing a finish that both conceals and strengthens them. Mr. Bean uses binding as a couture finish at a neckline, hem, or sleeve edge. We will show you how to measure, cut, and construct a double or French binding that is hand-finished. To determine the width of the binding strip, cut bias or cross-grain strips 6 times the desired finish width plus 1/4 inch. Our example is for a finished binding that is 1/2 inch, so the cut width of the binding is 3 1/4 inches. To determine the length of the strip needed, pin the bodice front and back pieces together at the shoulder seams. It is important to remember that the seam allowances must be trimmed away before attaching a binding at a neckline or hem edge. Mark a new stitching line for the bias strip 1/2 inch in from this new cut edge. Measure along the new seam line and double this figure as we're working with 1/2 of the pattern. Leave extra fabric at the end for finishing allowance. To achieve a perfect binding, cut strips of fabric on the true bias for a woven fabric. To determine true bias, fold the fabric diagonally at one end using the 45-degree angled line on your gridded mat as a guide. Using the fold as a guide, mark parallel lines on the fabric with a chalk marker. Knit fabrics, such as this wool jersey, can be cut on the crosswise grain instead of the bias and still have the right amount of stretch and shaping ability. Always pre-shape bias strips to match curves of the garment edge. Fold the fabric in half lengthwise with wrong sides together. Pin the folded edge of the binding on the new stitching line of the pattern pieces and steam lightly without putting the weight of the iron on the fabric. Be careful not to stretch the bias. Your objective is to shape the binding to match the garment curve. To apply the binding, place raw edges of the binding at the neck edge. Stitch the binding at a distance from the edge slightly less than the width of the finished binding. Turn the binding over seam allowances. Pin and slip stitch by hand. Although this technique requires a bit more preparation, the finished results are well worth the time.
Piping, cording, and tubing each serve a different function and design, but they all have something in common. And Kenneth King is here to show us just what that is. Where do you begin, Kenneth?
We begin by making bias strips. This is what they all have in common.
Okay.
To get the true bias, we fold the fabric, matching a selvage edge to an edge that's torn on grain. And I've pressed a crease here. this will be the guideline for the true bias. From here, you draw your lines on the true bias for the desired width of the strip. And as you can see, we've gone all the way down the piece.
Now, you've used a piece. Is this for demonstration reasons? Is this about the size that you'd like to cut? What, about 1/4 of a yard or?
1/4 of a yard or ½ yard works quite nicely.
Okay.
From here, we will be cutting off the end triangle from the piece. And now the fun begins.
This is history. This is goodbye,
This is
right?
history,
Okay.
yes. So the object of the game is to align the seam in such a way that you can cut this entire strip as one big spiral.
Oh, okay. Can't
So-
wait to see that.
We match up the end of strip number 1 with the beginning of strip number 2 by folding the fabric in half. We're going to be stitching a 1/4 of an inch seam, so we align it so that the two lines intersect so that the cut edges will meet right
All
there.
right. Then what?
Then we pin all the way down the piece, and we'll stitch one continuous seam on the sewing machine, 1/4 of an inch from the edge.
Do you need to check each one of those intersections, or if you've drawn your line straight, I guess there's no need to do that?
If you've drawn your line straight, it should match. I'm going to be showing you 2 different ways of cutting also. Okay, we're at the end. Using the edge of the foot as our guide, we just sew the seam.
And your starting point was the first intersection.
That's correct. And I found when making bias strips, it works to have a fairly short stitch. Set the stitch length on 1.5 millimeters. This way, when you press and after you fill, the seam lies flat and doesn't open up showing the thread. We're at the last. Our next step will be to press. And since we're making a tubular piece of fabric, we'll use our seam roll to press the seam open.
What's the advantage of using a sleeve roll?
It gets into the sleeve quite nicely. If you have a sleeve board, that's also helpful. And as you can see, while we're working it around the seam roll, that the seam that we're pressing does tend to work into a spiral. Now, one thing to note, we're using this method on woven fabrics. When you're working with a knit, since you do have stretch, you don't need to cut your strips on the bias. You cut them on the straight of grain.
It has enough give that it will make the curves that you want to make anyway, right?
Exactly. So we have our tube. Now, 2 methods of cutting. One is very laborious. The other one is quite cool.
Now, which are you showing us?
The laborious method.
Oh, well, why don't we get the quite cool way?
Well, save the best for
Oh,
last.
okay.
The laborious way is just to cut into a spiral all the way around. Just follow the line, and it will spiral down the piece.
Well, this is a major breakthrough for me because I've always individually joined each seam, you know, where you cross them and sew each seam together. This is wonderful.
Well, what I found is that when you're working with a stripe, if you want to make a stripe piping, you
Yes.
still have to piece it individually to match the
In order
stripes.
to do a perfect match, sure.
So you get the idea how it unreels,
That's wonderful.
and you have bias strips.
great.
So this is the laborious method. Now, with no thread in the needle on the overlock machine, you can set the gauge and just use the knife and cut it off on the machine.
Well, let's see how that
That's
works.
the quick method.
Okay, let's see.
So we go over to our serger, lay our strip in, and fire away.
So you're able to cut the strips by taking the thread out of the serger. What do you use for a guide for cutting?
There's a little red mark on the foot that tells exactly where the blade is. So at the end, you trim off the excess,
The other triangle.
the other triangle, and you've produced 6 yards of bias strips.
And these
pressed
are
and ready.
2-inch strips,
That's correct.
and you cut them out of, what was your bidding piece of fabric?
It was 3/8 of a yard, 45 inches wide.
That's amazing. You produced a lot of bias strips. Now, what are we going to do with it? That's the
Well-
important thing.
First, we're going to be doing piping. Now, we're doing piping and cording. Piping is very fine, such as what you have around the neckline of your dress. Cording is much thicker, and usually it's used more in home decoration than in clothing. We're working with knit. As you can see, it was cut on the cross grain of the fabric.
Right. Just the reminder that you don't need to use the bias again there.
And the fill, normally they have a cotton fill for piping. I prefer to use the rat tail because it's more rigid so that when you put it in a garment, it gives a more even thickness of piping all around the
A
garment.
little more definition, too, I would guess.
Correct. We changed the foot to a bulky overlock foot. The reason we use this foot is that there's a groove in the bottom of the foot that is large enough to allow the rat tail to pass through when we construct the piping. In this method, we move our needle position to the half left. To construct the piping, we fold the strips we cut in half and put the rat tail under the bulky overlock foot, right in the groove. And when constructing the piping, I like to make the stitch about 2.75 millimeters, a slightly long stitch. And the beauty of this particular foot is that you really don't have to guide it that much.
The foot's doing it for you, isn't it?
Exactly.
And stitching right up against the edge of the piping. That's wonderful.
And here we have finished piping.
That really works well. Now, is the idea that the rat tail is left loose? That's the idea, that you've just stitched right up against the edge but never through it.
That's correct. From here, I'll show how to make cording. Slightly different operation. With cording, we use a cotton cable, and as you can see, we've done some Scotch tape at the ends to keep it from unraveling. And we use a different foot, one of my favorites. This is a roller foot. And an advantage of this particular foot is that you can move the needle position far left and get the needle right up next to that foot, but it allows enough room between the throat plate and the foundation of the foot for the cable to pass through.
Even one this large.
That's correct. And again, fold our cable into our strip of fabric, put the roller foot down, and begin stitching. On this one, it helps to pull the cable back slightly so that the needle doesn't pass through the cable itself, so it just sews the seam allowances. And now we're finished.
So there's your cording.
And this shows the difference between cording and piping.
Really just a matter of scale.
Matter of scale, matter of construction technique.
Now we know how to make bias strips, how to do piping, how to do cording. What's next? Tubing?
Tubing is very, very fun and easy. It started with the same bias strips, and you start with a strip 2 times as wide as the desired thickness of your tubing.
Okay.
Because the seam allowances will fill up the inside. So this will give us about, I'd say 3/8 of an inch tube.
Okay.
We attach some coordinate thread to one end, and we'll be laying the coordinate thread into the fold. The coordinate thread is what we use to pull everything to the right side. Back to the machine. We use our regular foot, and we start where the knot is that we've tied with our coordinate. You need to shorten your stitches to begin so that the end won't burst when you're pulling it right side out. And it's a simple matter of allowing the thread to lie in the fold, and then you stitch right down the center of your strip. Now that we're at the end, it's a simple matter of turning. Trim away at the beginning end to make turning easier.
You create a little point.
Correct. And then start to pull the tubing to the right side.
Especially with a piece that's that small, this can be very tricky. You have to work it through carefully. That looks beautiful, though, Kenneth. It's wonderful.
And voila.
That's it. So, Kenneth, you've finished the tubing, and you've shown us a wonderful way to cut bias strips. That was really neat. I like that. And now we know how to do perfect piping and also perfect cording. I think we're really ready to tackle any Geoffrey Beene design. Thanks so much, Kenneth. And you know, with just 2 Geoffrey Beene designs, including a dress, a long full jacket, and a fitted suit, you can create many sophisticated, high-fashion looks. And we're going to show you those looks against the architecture of the World Financial Center. But first, let's find out how to perfect our skills of top and edge stitching.
A popular form of fashion stitchery, top stitching emphasizes the structural lines of your garment while working to keep the seams and edges flat and crisp. Although done by machine, it gives the same detailed look as fine hand sewing. To prepare a seam for top stitching, sew a 5/8 inch seam and press the seam as stitched to meld the stitches. Trim across the corner and grade the seam, leaving the widest seam allowance towards the garment. Press the seam open over a seam roll before turning and pressing. Use silk buttonhole twist in the needle, a size 16 needle, and a longer stitch length. You may have to loosen your sewing machine tension. Stitch carefully, using a seam guide for a straight edge. Stitch 2 lines close together on heavy fabrics. Leave thread ends long enough to be pulled to the wrong side with a needle and secured. In addition to being decorative, edge stitching defines the outlines of collars, bands, and cuffs in lightweight fabrics. An edge stitching foot assures you that the stitching will be parallel to the edge. Generally, matching sewing thread is used in edge stitching. With a minimum of effort, top stitching can create a couture finish on any garment.
The intent is to simplify clothing, make it more modern, more versatile, light in weight so that it doesn't wrinkle. All those factors that help accommodate a society that is very quick-paced.
As we learned earlier, Geoffrey Beene is a designer whose work best exemplifies the beauty and craftsmanship of couture details. His creations are intricately constructed from the inside out, like a building or a fine piece of furniture. The result is beautiful, fitted, structured garments. Some of his details actually evoke images of postmodern architecture. The overall shape is usually asymmetrical, and there is rarely a typical lapel, collar, or hemline. Unlike many designers who continue to call upon the past for inspiration, Geoffrey Beene moves into the future, creating entirely new designs each season. In order to take a closer look at Geoffrey Beene's work, we selected 2 jackets with the designer's typical flair, which of course isn't typical at all. Lynn and Amy are wearing examples of Geoffrey Beene's fine designs. Lynn's 3/4 length oversized jacket is rendered in mohair and is unlined. It's constructed yet easy to wear, working over a dress as here or even over jeans for the weekend. This fitted jersey dress accentuates the female shape and contrasts the looser silhouette of the jacket. The asymmetrical fall of this wrap jacket is a modern detail, contrasted by the somewhat soft overall drape of the garment. The bold single lapel is another unique detail. The dress is detailed with contrast piping in the same jersey fabric, sewn on a distinctive angle. And different accessories can make this design more or less modern to suit your personal style. Amy is wearing a more modern Geoffrey Beene design reflecting his signature details. It's asymmetrical and innovative, yet beautifully classic. Overall, the suit is more structured. The most unique attribute of the jacket is a unique front placket at the lapel that's framed by contrasting colors. Another button holds the top piece in place. This is a striking, inspired detail. One of the great assets of Geoffrey Beene's designs is versatility. By switching Lynn and Amy's jackets and accessories, sporty becomes dressy and vice versa. Amy is now more casual, with a sweater topping the skirt, and the 3/4 length mohair jacket takes on a more relaxed attitude. Her accessories work to reflect this new personality, but the distinctive Beene style always prevails. Lynn is dressed appropriately for a dinner engagement. The structured jacket works beautifully with a fitted dress. Remove the jacket, and the dress is still terrific on its own. You can build a classic wardrobe beginning with these few Geoffrey Beene pieces because they can work as separates in a variety of combinations to create many different fashion looks. We hope that the inspired design of Geoffrey Beene will encourage you to try new variations in your own creations. Remember, the magic is in the details, and that with just 2 patterns, you can create a lot of magic in your wardrobe for both day and evening. We hope that the inspired design of Geoffrey Beene will encourage you to try new variations in your own creations. Remember, the magic is in the details. As busy, active women, our fashion needs can be as diversified as our lifestyles. Ellen Tracy designer Linda Allard understands these needs and designs wardrobes just for us. Here now are some of the professional secrets of Linda Allard for Ellen Tracy. Welcome to Sewing Today. Ellen Tracy designer Linda Allard really understands the fashion needs of today's active, time-juggling women because, of course, she's a very busy woman herself. We'll meet Ms. Allard in the Ellen Tracy showroom and find out about her approach to wardrobe basics. We'll show you how a skirt or pant waistband can be adjusted for a smooth, comfortable fit. And Kenneth King, our expert sewing instructor, will give us a lesson in applying a front band. It's a detail which highlights the Linda Allard design we're featuring. You'll learn how to professionally finish seams and hems with an overlock machine, and how a 4-garment pattern can provide a week's worth of fashion. But first, let's meet the woman who designed Ellen Tracy's wardrobing pattern, Linda Allard. If a woman had nothing but Ellen Tracy in her closet, that would be enough. Linda, how do you explain the tremendous appeal of Ellen Tracy?
Well, I think it's several things. I think, first of all, we make clothes that women feel wonderful in, and I think that's very important, that when you go out to face the world, you feel terrific. They fit well. I think they're clothes that you invest in. They wear well. You don't get tired of them. They're new looking, but they're not so trendy that you will be sick of it by the time the next season rolls around. And we have a lot of color, and women like to wear color.
Well, you have wonderful color here, and you're known for your terrific combinations of color. Can you give us some guidelines when we're choosing colors to sew with that we might put together, we might not have thought otherwise to have done?
Well, I think that's mystique, color, and I think you only learn that by sort of playing with color. It's very interesting when you take a color like this oregano color, which is a beautiful neutral, and pair it with something that's totally unexpected, like the plum or the lavender. It creates a totally different feeling than when you put it together with the red or the watermelon. And you only can do that, I think, by playing with the colors and putting them together yourself and saying, gee, I think that's very pretty.
It might be a good idea to clear up any confusion that people might have. Linda Allard, Ellen Tracy. Who is who?
Well, I'm Linda Allard, and the name of the company is Ellen Tracy. Ellen Tracy's been in business for 45 years. I haven't been here quite that long.
When I think of Ellen Tracy, or Linda Allard for that matter, I think of the perfect jacket. It's always so pivotal in your collection. How do you manage to keep your jackets so fresh?
Well, why don't we have a look at some of the new jackets?
I'd love to see. This group shows such a variety, not only in color, but also in line, length, everything.
Yes, we have a little bit of everything. Why don't we start with this duster coat, unlined, very lightweight and fluid, perfect for summer.
I love the fact that it goes to great new lengths, too.
It's wonderful. Now, you normally wouldn't think of this as a jacket, but it performs exactly as a jacket would.
Here's a classic.
This is great. Shirt jacket, belted, very soft and fluid, again, unlined. And then we have the more traditional type jacket. This one, very shaped in the waist, shorter, very feminine, fitted little jacket. And then this one being boxier, more relaxed, an easy jacket for every woman, every body shape to wear.
Linda, when your clothing is shown on the runway, every outfit is coordinated from head to toe. How do you suggest that we achieve that total look?
Well, when we start the collection, we start with great pieces. For example, this wonderful blazer in silk with a very wide leg, soft silk pant. What we do is create the pieces, then we put them together like a puzzle. Now, we would try, this jacket is wonderful as a suit, but if you hand me that nectarine pant, how pretty this is as a separate jacket. So what we do is just keep playing with it, and we could try...
All new looks. All right, where do we go from here?
Let's try the little short flippy skirt.
Oh, this is cute.
Isn't this a wonderful shape? Look how wonderful that is for... And you put this under this jacket, you create a totally different look. This is a wonderful look for evening. Sexy, flippy, and soft.
Right, fluid. You do. You get a whole, another mood is evolving here, isn't it?
Sort of that masculine-feminine combination.
Well, what happens with this?
Well, this is a short. This is in a georgette, and I think this is a wonderful new look for spring. The short shorts with long legs and sandally shoes, it's great, and it's wonderful with this jacket.
Well, what about accessories? I think that also plays such an important part in that head-to-toe look.
Well, I love this shoe. We featured this shoe in the spring collection a lot because I think it's a terrific looking shoe. It's very sexy. It's wonderful with the flippy skirt. It's wonderful with the pants and really superb with the little short.
And I can see how you could really change the look if you went to this group of accessories.
Yes, this shoe gives an entirely different look. More tailored, still feminine though because it's got a strappy back, but a totally different, more structured kind of look. Suede is beautiful for spring.
Linda, your use of menswear-inspired fabrics gives your clothing a tailored edge, and yet you manage to remain very feminine. How do you create this balance?
It's a wonderful look, isn't it? Here's some examples.
Good. Well, if this is menswear, everyone wants to be a man. It's wonderful.
I think this is a perfect example of what we're talking about. Obviously a menswear jacket, menswear texture, but feel the fabric.
Oh, it's so
delicious.
Soft, lovely.
Very fluid, very sexy. Then if you select a trouser, obviously a classic menswear looking trouser, but again, the fabric is very fluid, moves with your body. And I think this is a wonderful example, a silk pinstripe.
Exactly, it has sort of a shirting stripe, but the sheen and
the movement,
luster.
right, it's very, very sexy and feminine. And of course, if you're going to wear menswear, you don't want to look like a man, so you would accessorize it differently. Wear a lycra sweater underneath it, perhaps a little camisole, or accessorize it with a wonderful fluid scarf. It's totally different than a masculine, sort of that masculine feminine look.
So when we're choosing fabric and we want the menswear feeling, we should look for the colorations of menswear, but the feeling, the softness that we like as women.
And we want to be women.
Linda, thank you very much. You've been wonderful. Depending on the fabric chosen, a duster can be versatile enough to wear as a dress or coat. Kenneth is here to show us how to finish the front band properly. But first, let's move down to the waistline. Too large a waistband looks sloppy and affects the line of a skirt or pants. And too tight? Well, none of us likes that feeling. So let's see how to adapt a pattern to give you the type waistband that works best for you.
Sometimes you may want to eliminate the waistband and finish with the yoke facing. This is a signature detail for the Ellen Tracy line. On the front and back pattern pieces, fold out the darts and tape them closed with removable tape. Draw a line from the center front to the side seam and from the center back to the side seam, approximately 2 5/8 inches down from the top edge of the pattern piece. Using a plain piece of pattern tissue, trace out the front and back pattern pieces, marking the straight of grain and the fold line at center front. Remove the tape from the darts of the body piece. Using the new pieces as your facing, cut out your fashion fabric and interfacing. Pants or skirts that have front darts and a rigid waistband are not always very flattering, nor are they as comfortable to wear as an elastic waist pant or skirt. Any pant or skirt pattern may be converted to a pattern that has an elastic waist. Tape the front and back tissue pieces to another larger piece of pattern tracing cloth or plain paper. On the tissue pattern pieces, eliminate the front and back darts and the zipper closing. From the widest part of the hip, draft a straight line up to the waistline with a pencil or marker. The waist opening should measure approximately the same as your hip measurement. For a finished 1-inch elastic band, extend the line up from the waist stitching line by 2 3/4 inches. This makes a cut-on waistband facing, not a separate one. On the front and back pieces, draw across the top to connect the 2 lines that you have drawn upward. Define your waistline with a piece of elastic. Keeping 1 finger behind the tape, measure your waistline and add 1 inch for ease. These 2 methods will ensure comfortable, flattering pants.
Obviously, if you're doing a slouchy jacket, you select a lighter weight, softer interfacing. If you want a more structured, more traditional menswear type jacket, you pick a totally different kind of interlining that has more structure to it.
The Linda Allard duster coat that we've been featuring today has a front band opening, and Kenneth King is here to show us exactly how to apply one of those front band openings. What are the reasons for this? Is it simply decorative?
It's decorative, and you can also use it to stabilize the front edge. So first, what we need to do is to get a pattern piece for the band itself. What I've done is to trace the seam lines onto the pattern, front and back, and I've drawn the red line here. What we're going to be making is an 1.25 inch finished width on our band. So the red line represents where that seam line will fall on the front and on the back pattern. After that, putting the pattern pieces on tissue paper, we trace out the seam lines that we've drawn. We trace out our outer cutting line, front and back pieces. What we end up with here, this will be the front band piece, and this will be the back. Now, to eliminate the shoulder seam, we fold the pattern along the seam line of the back piece, and we attach it to the front.
I'll hold that. Four-handed sewing, it's sort of a new duet strategy.
Yes. So you notice that we've taken the seam allowance off here. We're going to have our seam at center back, so we need to add a 5/8 inch seam allowance to the center back. After that, you see our matching marks that we've done. This is our seam line that was in red on the pattern piece. And then we add a 5/8 inch seam allowance so we can attach it to the body. And as you can see on the body piece,
Here, I'll hand that back in so we're perfectly clear here.
the red line was the seam line. The black line represents the 5/8 inch seam allowance you would add. Then we would cut away this portion of the pattern piece. And this would be our new cutting line. This would be our stitching line.
Okay.
Once we have the pattern piece finished, we're going to start by doing 2 different types of construction. The first one is by stitching the band to the body with a 4-thread overlock stitch, encasing all 3 seam allowances.
All right, this is this is the major seam that attaches the front band to the body of the garment.
That's correct. And as you've noticed, we've already stitched our 2 band pieces together, and we've stitched across the bottom.
Okay, I'm just going to open that up so we can take a peek inside and see the serge seam that you've made previously, and then I notice you've also favored it a little bit to the inside.
That's correct. Take it over to the overlock machine. We'll be sewing with a 4-thread overlock stitch. And we have a nice little guide right here set on 5/8 of an inch so that we can stitch and trim all in the same operation. There we are.
Oh, it's very nice. Let's see. Lay it out and we'll see what you have there.
And then once we're finished, we'll press the seam allowances to the body side of the piece. One would use a pressing cloth on this, but for demonstration, we're using just the bare iron. And voila.
That's very nice finish. So you've not only attached the band, but you've also finished it at the same time.
That's correct.
It's beautiful. It's a nice application. And that one's finished.
That one's finished. Now the second application is done slightly differently. As you can see, we've sewn the two parts of the band together with the overlock and pressed as we did before. The back half has been finished along the raw edge, and the front part of the band is pinned to the body. Of course, we finished with an overlock stitch blind hem. On this one, the advantage of this particular seam is we can sew stay tape with the overlock onto this seam, and that will keep the seam from stretching over time. When completed, the stay tape will be enclosed in the construction so that you don't see it.
Okay, let's see how you do that, Kenneth.
We start by raising our presser foot on the serger, turning the foot out, and inserting the twill tape into the little slot, and then swinging it back closed. Then we lower the foot, and take a few stitches so that the tape will be feeding in, and we're ready to sew our seam. And the beauty of this operation is that it sews the seam, secures the seam, and finishes the seam all in one operation. You notice, Nancy, that when the twill tape is fed into the machine, it's not being cut. It bypasses the knife.
So you're only cutting off the seam allowance on the fabric that you're stitching.
That's correct.
That's great. Now we can't even see it. It's buried there.
That's correct. Once we've trimmed our edges away, go back to the pressing table, and we will press our seam allowances towards the band. So next, we need to finish the bottom of this band.
And what's the procedure there?
Procedure is to put the right sides of the band together, like so, and we will be sewing a seam from where the hem falls right across to the end. So on our machine, I start by doing a back stitch a little bit. And secure it again. From here, it's a matter of trimming before we turn it to press. What seam allowance are you leaving there, Kenneth? I leave 1/4 1/4 inch for the back side and about 3/8 for the front. This is a graded seam. And then we clip our corners. We turn, and then once we're finished, we'll press.
Do you favor the seam and the band to the inside a little bit?
Yes. To finish, how we're going to be closing this seam is we will be stitching in the ditch from the top side of the fabric. So our seam line will run right into that edge right there. We switch our foot to the edge stitching foot. And the beauty of the edge stitching foot is you run the guide right along the seam, and if you keep your needle in the center position, it gets right into the ditch of the seam.
It is important to remember just to put a little bit of tension when you're pulling that fabric apart, right?
That's right. And when we get to the end, we backstitch to secure. And the finished piece.
Oh, so this is totally finished.
Totally finished.
You finished it
Final
on
press.
the front side by stitching in the ditch and, of course, also secured it to the back.
That's correct.
That's a wonderful finish. Thank you. In today's economy, we need to get the most for our fashion dollar, and the best way to do that is to make clothes which work separately or together for many different occasions. We'll show you how our 4-piece wardrobe can take you almost anywhere. But first, let's look at a few serger options for giving your sewing project professional-looking seams and hems. With the increasing popularity of the serger in home sewing, you can now make professional edge and seam finishes on all types of fabrics, but the serger is a natural for sewing with knits. Edge finishing may be accomplished with either a 3-thread or 4-thread stitch formation. The 3-thread option is less bulky. The differential feed feature on a machine can be adjusted to prevent puckers or waving. If the knit fabric has a tendency to curl, edge finishing helps the seam to lie flat. If you want a narrow stretch seam on a lightweight knit, seams are best done with a 3-thread stitch formation. A 4-thread stitch formation works best on medium weight knits. The 4th thread stabilizes the seam. Most sergers have an extra accessory called a blind stitch attachment. This foot allows you to do a blind hem or a false blind hem. The blind hem is appropriate for hemming garments in medium to heavyweight jerseys and knits. Press up the hem, turn the garment back so that about 1/4 to 5/8 inch of fabric protrudes. Using a 3-thread overlock in the right needle, set the stitch length to 4 and the cutting width to 2. Place the fabric under the foot and adjust the guide plate so that the fold of the fabric is in line with the needle. Sew the fabric with the fold against the guide. Open out the fabric and press lightly on the wrong side. The false blind hem is used in medium weight jersey and sweatshirt fabric and is ideal for leisure wear. Again, press the hem up and turn back the fabric so that about 1/4 to 5/8 inch of fabric protrudes. This time, adjust the guide to the right so that the needle fully pierces the fold. Use a 3-thread overlock stitch, a 2.5 stitch length, and a 2 cutting width. After sewing, press the hem flat. You will have an easy-to-sew and very durable hem finish.
I think, first of all, we make clothes that women feel wonderful in. And I think that's very important, that when you go out to face the world, you feel terrific. They fit well. I think they are clothes that you invest in. They wear well. You don't get tired of them.
In this segment of Making It Yours, we'll show you how a Linda Allard for Ellen Tracy pattern will provide you with a fabulous 4-piece wardrobe that can work for the many facets of your busy life by using creative combinations, interesting accessories, and thought to your own style. One of the looks we really like utilizes longer flowing silhouettes combined with layering. It's a feminine, unique style that lends itself to the creative wardrobing that's necessary for today's woman who has too many places to go and never enough time. Especially time for worrying about having clothes to suit the occasion. Linda Allard for Ellen Tracy has created a versatile, simple yet distinctive wardrobe for today's woman on the go. We've made this ensemble in wool jersey that's perfect for the executive woman. It's wrinkle-free, easy care, and travels well. 3 pieces from our pattern are used here for a professional, crisp style. The long, high-waisted skirt that features a provocative side slit is paired with a distinctive double-breasted white blouse that's notable for its exaggerated, rounded lapels. The collarless duster moves beautifully, helping to create a uniquely professional style while remaining simply feminine. The duster is a particularly valuable piece in this wardrobe. It can also be worn as a dress for day-to-evening wear. You can wear the duster during the day at the office and slip off the skirt and blouse, add some glamorous accessories, and it's a whole new look. Rhinestone buttons or decorative button covers help to transform the attitude of the dress. We've selected a velvet shawl, velvet pumps, evening jewelry, and topped it off with a jaunty beret. Because the dress is so versatile, you can select whatever items fit your style. Not only do these pieces work to create a professional image, they can also be combined for a distinctive casual look. The same unlined duster has been created in a Navajo blanket pattern. It's a totally different mood. The casual yet considered fashion statement is accomplished by pairing the high-waisted flowing pants with the white blouse. The Navajo duster can also be worn with the blue wool jersey duster for a transitional season look. Notice how details like the duster buttons finish this piece with flair and style. Casual shoes, a sporty scarf, and simple hairstyle leave you feeling free to have plenty of fun. The duster here works like an elongated shirt, worn alone with the graceful pants. It's an alternative look that works for office or evening, while allowing the comfort we all need from our basic wardrobe as we're always off to somewhere new. There are so many other ways to use the 4 basic elements in this pattern in combination with other pieces in your wardrobe. Just use your creativity, remember that layering is in, and enjoy discovering new looks from your old wardrobe using these ideas for inspiration. Well, I hope you've enjoyed meeting one of my favorite designers, Linda Allard, who created our Go Anywhere wardrobe for the Ellen Tracy Company and for us too. I'm sure you've noticed when browsing through the pattern catalog certain fashions themed around the editorial approach of major women's magazines, such as Essence and Family Circle. One of our Sewing Today programs featured designs specifically from these 2 magazines. Here now are the how-to segments from this Sewing Today program. Family Circle magazine has chosen this lined vest to represent clothing that they felt would work well for their readers. A colorful vest is a great way to accent pieces already in your wardrobe. This echoes the Family Circle philosophy of a dollar-saving approach to contemporary good looks. And Kenneth King is here today to get us started on our own vest. Where do we begin?
Well, first, the success of any fashionable vest begins with the fabric choice. Here we have a lovely print. We've cut out the front and back body pieces out of the pattern. And to eliminate the facings, we'll be using the same pattern pieces to cut a lining. So when we have the lining pieces cut, we do what is called favoring. And favoring is trimming a scant 1/8 of an inch off of the outside edges and the armhole edges of the piece. What this does is it causes the seams, when pressed, to fall to the back side of the fabric. And this is how it's done. It's very simple.
This is the kind of job where a rotary cutter really comes in handy, isn't it?
Exactly. So our first fun thing today is we're going to be adding a belt to the back piece. We have our pattern piece. And what we've done on the pattern piece is to draft an inch-wide belt, which will be attached into the dart. So once it's been drafted, we go to pattern paper, trace out the seam lines, and you can see how the pattern piece lines up with the waistline, and you can see how we have drawn 5/8" seam allowances along here. We travel over here and attaching it in to the seam, we line up our matching notch
Yes.
and put the seam allowance into the fold of the dart and pin closed. This is the standard stitch length of 2 millimeters on the machine. So once we're at the end of our dart, it's always best to tie it off. This will help prevent the dart from unraveling over time and keep it from bubbling. Our threads are clipped. And the darts for the belt, when we insert the belt, the darts will be pressed towards the side seams. So,
Well, it really does add a nice touch. I like the bright fabric against the print.
and this is long enough that we can make a nice little knot.
There it is.
Like so.
What's the next step in the vest?
Now we assemble, putting the lining pieces to the body pieces. And as you can see, we're going to be leaving a little open on both the front and the back bottom edge. This will be for hand closing later.
All right, about how much are you leaving there?
It's about 3 inches.
I'd say that too.
And again, back to the machine.
And this is just a standard 5/8" seam.
Correct. And we end it. Now that we're all done, we trim and grade our seams and clip our corners as we normally would. The fashion fabric is trimmed a scant 3/8 inch.
Okay.
So, once we're all graded and trimmed, it's a simple matter of turning everything right side out, like so.
And there it comes.
Now we have one front half and the other front half. And since the side seams are open, we can now take our point turner and crisp up our points and prepare for pressing. So once we have our fronts crisped up, we're ready to press.
Are there any tips you can give us on successfully pressing this vest with the favored seams?
Yes. It's best to work with the lining facing up on the pressing table and position it so that you see just a slight bit of the fabric peeking out over the seam.
So we should be seeing about the 1/8 inch that we cut off the lining.
That's correct.
Okay, good rule of thumb. Okay, now that we've turned it and pressed it, what comes next? I know you have another vest that's in the next stage, already pressed.
Our final step will be sewing the side seams. And this is why we left the bottom edges open, front and back. We join the side seams by aligning up the side seam with the underarm seam and pin the fashion fabric, then pin the lining and stitch this seam. This is a U-shaped seam. Once our side seam is sewn, we clip all of our corners and press the seam open. The bottom edges are then pressed under, pinned in place, and hand-stitched closed. And for the final finish, we'll be covering buttonholes and sewing on buttons. We'll be using a keyhole buttonhole on this vest. When making a keyhole buttonhole, you need an additional 1/4 inch in length to accommodate the round portion of the end of the keyhole. The length and the horizontal line are marked onto the fabric We're using pins in this case, but normally one would use thread basting. We go to our machine and program in the keyhole buttonhole, and the advantage of these computerized machines is that once the first buttonhole is programmed in, all of the others are the exact length. Next, we'll be showing how to sew buttons on with the machine. We use our button sew on foot, and we use the button sew on program on the machine. Place the button under the foot, aligning the holes on either side of the center bar, and hand walk the machine down to test to see if the zigzag is wide enough to clear the holes in the button. From here, it's a simple matter of just hitting the foot feed and letting the machine do the work. And there we have it.
Kenneth, that's terrific. Just 2 more buttons to sew on, and we have a finished vest. It's wonderful, thanks. As Susan Taylor explained earlier, Essence readers sew for many reasons, and we've chosen some very glamorous looks to show you. 2 finishing details on this dramatic blouse are the rolled hem on the ruffled collar and cuffs and bias tubing tie closing. Kenneth is now going to show us both traditional and overlock easy ways to accomplish these details. What are you going to start with first, Kenneth?
What I'm going to show you now is 2 hem finishes for the bias ruffle and how to make the bias tubing for the tie.
All right, well, let's get started.
As always, we start by cutting out the fabric from the pattern, and as you can see, this is the shape of the pattern, and that gives us the ripple. For our first operation, we'll cover a rolled hem on the machine, and this requires first the rolled hemming foot. We have it already on the machine, and the big problem most people experience is how to get the rolled hem started. What we do is to shorten the stitch length on the machine to 1 millimeter and stitch diagonally across the corner, and then trim with the scissors to about 1/8 of an inch. With the 2 ends of the threads that are left from this stitching, we use these threads to maneuver the fabric into the foot. Once we get the fabric into the foot, we start to stitch and curl the edge of the fabric over so that the raw edge of the fabric lines up with the notch mark on the machine, on the foot actually. This shows exactly how much we need to roll.
But that does make a beautiful finish.
So the thickness of the hem is dependent on the foot. We have some different feet here. Now the choice of your foot depends upon the weight of the fabric, and as you can see, the thickness of the groove will correspond to the thickness of the hem.
Oh, all right.
Now, the quick and easy rolled hem on the serger. When we feed thin fabrics through making a rolled hem, we need to back them with a water-soluble stabilizer. This ensures an even stitch. It keeps the little threads of the fabric from poking through between the stitches and just makes life easier for everyone. The advantage of this particular stitch is it rolls the fabric, finishes, and cuts all in one operation. We need to trim the water-soluble stabilizer close to the stitching, and the first time you launder the garment, the stabilizer will vanish.
That's great.
And we have a perfect rolled hem.
It makes a beautiful finish. It really does. Well, and what's the next step?
Our final step is bias tubing done on the serger. We cut our bias strips in the usual fashion. Using the same rolled hem stitch, we'll wind off enough chain to pull through the length of tubing that we desire. After we've rolled off enough chain, we fold the bias strip, lie the chain in the fold, and stitch the seam with the rolled hem stitch. Once we've stitched the seam, it's just a simple matter of pulling the chain and turning the tubing right side out.
Kenneth, that's great. Now we have both of the details that were featured on the Essence pattern. Not only the tubing, which makes such a nice closing, but of course the rolled hem for the big fluffy collar that we did on the machine and on the overlock. We hope you've enjoyed and gained useful sewing tips and ideas for your next apparel project from viewing this video, The Best of Sewing Today. If you would like to receive similar videos on crafts and home decorating, call this toll-free number now.
Information on designer fashion techniques demonstrated on Sewing Today is available in the Simon & Schuster book, Designer Sewing Techniques, with over 200 step-by-step color photographs. Send check or money order for $20 to Sewing Today, WKNO P.O. Box 1510, Altoona, Pennsylvania 16603. Or have your credit card ready and call toll-free 1-800-956-6739.
If you want to sew like the pros on Sewing Today, get your machine from the company that supplied the sewers and sergers used on Sewing Today, Bernina. Bernina has engineered a complete line of sewing machines for any project, budget, or level of sewing experience. And all our machines offer Bernina's legendary stitch precision, quality, and service. For professional finishing touches, choose from Bernina's complete line of sergers for fashions, home decorating, or crafts. The Sergers Vogue pattern readers voted #1. They're perfect for creating seams, hems, and gathers. For the dealer nearest you, call 1-800-4852-SEW. Nothing sews like a Bernina. Nothing. Receive a $25 factory rebate when you purchase a Bernina sewing machine, a Bernina 2000D or 2000DE series serger.
The preceding was made possible by Bernina of America, delivering sewing technology and education to sewers worldwide.
And by Vogue and Butterick Patterns, providing fashion and lifestyle leadership for the home sewer into the next century.